What's up, everybody? Welcome to Greatness Begins, the PlayStation show where I, Ryan Turford, the man on the moose, tell you all about my favorite 50 PlayStation 1 games of all time. So, folks, if you're listening to this on podcast feeds and you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button on your podcast feed of choice. Don't forget to leave us a rating if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And then, last but not least, if you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to hit that like button. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and ding, ding, ding. Don't forget to hit that notification bell to be notified whenever we go live or when we have a new video. And today, I'm pretty excited to talk about today's game because for folks that don't know or have been listening to us for a while, you probably know I like licensed games a whole lot. You know, whether it's, Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, or Alien Trilogy a couple weeks ago. I really like licensed games, especially the PS1 as well. Was like a great console for really weird and goofy and kind of experimental, licensed games. We got, Alien Trilogy and today's games, but we also got, a lot of really bad licensed games as well based off, good properties like The Fifth Element or Independence Day or all kinds of, crazy stuff. If there was a popular franchise that was out during the PlayStation 1 era, it probably had a licensed game on the PlayStation 1 because everyone was, trying this new kind of experimental 3D technology with games, and they were basically throwing ideas at the wall to basically see what would stick. And licensed games are kind of a good way to do that because they kind of, force you to be within a certain realm of, to have the setting and to basically have everything kind of presented in front of you. So then you can kind of build the game around that. So you saw a lot of people take a lot of risks with licensed games during the PlayStation 1 era. And sometimes, just sometimes, you'd actually have really good licensed games that would come out of the PlayStation 1 era. And mind you, today's not going to be the last time I talk about a licensed game on the list, but today's licensed game is a perfect example of that because it's a game that, in theory, you would think probably wouldn't work, or I probably wouldn't put on a list like this, where it's actually a really good game. But this game is really awesome as long as you turn your brain off a little bit. And that game, folks, Die Hard Trilogy on the PlayStation 1. This was basically meant to be like covering the entire trilogy of Die Hard. Now, it's different from Alien Trilogy that I covered a couple weeks ago on the show because that game literally had nothing to do with the movies at all. It was basically, other than using Ripley as a character and then using some of the environments from the movie, that was about it. Whereas Die Hard Trilogy, believe it or not, is trying to be a faithful recreation of the three Die Hard movies. Now, this game came out in North America on August 31st, 1996, and it was developed by Probe Entertainment, released by Fox Interactive here in North America, which, of course, Probe probably sounds familiar because, again, I just talked about them 2 weeks ago on the show because they were also the developers on Alien Trilogy, and they also were in development around the same time. Like Die Hard Trilogy started to be developed a little bit after Alien Trilogy, but for the most part, they were being developed during the same time window. Also, this was also meant to coincide with Die Hard with a Vengeance, which came out in 1995. And this was originally, believe it or not, supposed to just be a Die Hard with a Vengeance video game. And a lot of the elements that we see in the final product, if essentially the main idea was for those to basically be like in throughout the entire events of Die Hard with a Vengeance, rather than, applying them to the whole trilogy. But what ended up happening, which made this a little bit interesting around this time, is that Probe, the software that was developed, the company developing this, was actually acquired by Acclaim, who actually published Alien Trilogy. Whereas, Probe had been working with Fox for years. I mentioned this on the Alien Trilogy episode, but they had been working on, Alien-specific games for forever. And that was in tandem with Fox. So when Fox Interactive wanted to become, more hands-on in the publishing process during this era of games, essentially. And after kind of Probe was acquired, they basically, shifted things around because the team wanted to prioritize, Alien Trilogy as kind of their big game coming out, even though it's funny how on a list like this, I'm actually ranking, Die Hard Trilogy a little bit higher than that game. So after that, they basically, the development kind of shifted to a smaller team of developers at Probe, and Fox has basically told them, look, you have access to all of the Die Hard movies. In fact, they were the ones who came up with the idea that it should be a trilogy rather than just Die Hard with a Vengeance. And they basically just said, like, just go nuts. We're not going to step in. Just kind of do what you want with this, and we hope it's good. Essentially, is what they told them. Essentially, there's a bunch of interviews about this as well that I'll reference in the show notes as well, because I thought they were actually really interesting. Because I think the development of this game is just wild and wacky and just could have gone in a million of different directions. And again, this game could have been terrible, but I think the development team actually made some key things to help, basically make sure that this game came out as good as possible. So let's talk about the game a little bit before I talk about some of those things. So first of all, as I mentioned, it's essentially covering the Die Hard trilogy, but it's essentially 3 different games in one. So you're not just getting one game. It's actually more like 3 smaller, like Xbox Live Arcade sized games on one disc, as opposed to basically just one big game, essentially. So we'll start with Die Hard, because the original Die Hard is a third-person shooter where you're basically fighting terrorists and rescuing hostages in Nakatomi Plaza, just like you'd expect a Die Hard game to be. I mean, the history of Die Hard games goes all the way back to the NES, where there was a Die Hard game there, which had a similar premise, and that game was not very good. Whereas, actually, again, this whole game has like a very arcadey feel to it, and running around Nakatomi Plaza, killing terrorists and rescuing people is actually a lot of fun. So I actually really like, Die Hard. And then Die Hard 2, Die Harder, what they decided to do for that one is, because of the way that movie's set up, and there's kind of like, less action than Die Hard 1, if that makes any sense. They made it more of an on-rails shooter this time around, where you're basically at the airport, the Delhi's airport, and you're essentially shooting different terrorists or people invading the airport, and you're trying not to shoot the civilians. It very much plays like a light gun game, like Time Crisis or House of the Dead or something like that, but it's Die Hard themed, which is cool. You can also, fun fact, play that mode using a light gun, which it would be really hard to do on today's TVs, or you can play it with the PlayStation 1 mouse. So if you're one of those people out there who has the PlayStation 1 mouse, or I think a third-party company actually makes a mouse for the PlayStation 1 now, because a lot of the light game games on PlayStation 1 also support the mouse. So that's one good way for us modern audiences to be able to play the game, is with the mouse, essentially, or at least find use for our PlayStation 1 mice, if you know what I mean. And then last but not least, Die Hard with a Vengeance, the movie that essentially was supposed to be kind of like the big crux of this whole thing. They basically just turned it into a driving game, very much like Crazy Taxi, except you're not really picking people up. You're basically driving around New York City in Samuel L. Jackson's taxi, and you're basically stopping off at different places to basically disarm the bombs, because that was a whole thing in Die Hard with a Vengeance, was, stopping the bombs being set by the terrorists in New York City. So that's essentially what you're doing in this game. But then you're not just driving, the taxi cab. You also drive a sports car, and then eventually you upgrade to a garbage truck for some reason. Again, it's very goofy and arcadey. And again, the gameplay is kind of king here. The story itself, they don't really go too much into the story, but they do have like a Bruce Willis kind of impersonator and a Samuel L. Jackson impersonator as far as the voices are concerned, because it is voiced. But you don't really have like cutscenes telling the story or anything like that. Like, story is not the main focus here. The main focus is the gameplay. And again, this came up in the interviews with the developers, because they were talking about what one of the big deals for them was making sure that the frame rate was rock solid for this game, because it runs at a solid 60 frames per second on the PlayStation 1, which is pretty impressive for an action game of this era, because a lot of the times, if you go back and look at some of these older games like Siphon Filter, for example, like a lot of them run at 20 to 30 frames per second, and it feels like kind of a muddy experience, whereas the developers at Probe really, really wanted to stress that frame rate and gameplay were king when it came to the development of this game. So they wanted to make sure that it was a fun experience and that it felt smooth to play, which also resulted in a lot of limitations visual-wise with the game, because this was also being developed at the same time for the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn, we know in retrospect, is just a less powerful console than the PlayStation 1. So they basically had to cut out polygonal models, for example, for the Die Hard 2 sequences, and things like that. So there are some little small changes, but at the same time, I actually think that the visual style that they went with, again, if you look at it from the lens of, this is like a 1996 arcade game that just, happens to have 3 different, movie selectors that give you 3 different gameplay experiences, I think it's totally a serviceable experience and just a lot of fun to play. Like, I had a blast revisiting it for the purposes of this podcast. I just had so much fun going back and playing it again. And it's admittedly a very fun game that you just play it over and over again. And you're kind of like, trying to get to the end, because there is definitely an ending to each game. They're not like traditional arcade experiences where they just, go on forever and ever and ever. But at the same time, I think all 3 games included in this are really fun. And they actually did make a sequel to this, which spoiler alert, didn't actually make my list, but it's also very good as well. Die Hard Trilogy 2 Viva Las Vegas, which has literally nothing to do with the rest of the trilogy of Die Hard movies. Is basically kind of like Alien Trilogy a couple weeks ago, where, you know, Bruce Willis's character is John McClane. He just goes to Las Vegas and then there's a whole adventure there, essentially. And it's kind of like an arcadey experience in the same way, but it's just a different type of experience than this one. So I actually think the OG Die Hard Trilogy is definitely the way to go if you're interested, and I definitely think it's a fun pickup. If you're playing it for the first time, if you like the Die Hard movies, I think this is a slam dunk. And if you don't like the Die Hard movies, but you like, you know, pick up and play arcadey experiences, whether you like on-rail shooters or third-person shooters, I think you're going to really dig Die Hard Trilogy. I think it's a lot of fun and definitely worth your time if you are collecting PlayStation 1 games. And it's definitely one of the better licensed games on the console for sure. And the downside, of course, and I talked about this on last week's episode with Fear Effect, there's no modern way to really play this game, unfortunately. Like I said, it's only on the Saturn and the PlayStation 1. So you don't really have any other way to play it besides the PlayStation 1. But as I was holding up here, I have the greatest hits copy. This goes for pretty cheap. You can probably get a complete copy for, you know, under $20. So, I mean, you have a cheap option available to you if you have access to a PlayStation 1 or a PlayStation 3, because this is my, you know, episode reminder that, hey, by the way, the PlayStation 3 also plays all the PS1 games as well. You just put your disc in and it totally works just fine. So there you go. That's everything you need to know about Die Hard Trilogy. What do you think about Die Hard Trilogy? If you're watching on YouTube, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can find us on Twitter at Carpool Gaming, on YouTube at youtube.com/Carpool Gaming, on Patreon at patreon.com/Carpool Gaming, and on podcast services around the globe. So I am Ryan Turford. This has been Greatness Begins, episode 3, and we're out.